What if the ground beneath us once shook with footsteps so large they seemed to belong to gods, not animals? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into a world where you are not the measure of all things, where your human frame becomes suddenly impossibly small. The grass towers above your head like green cathedrals, each blade thick enough to hide behind, strong enough to support your weight as you climb toward a sky that feels both closer and infinitely more distant than the one you know. This is not fantasy, this is memory, Earth's memory, written in stone and buried in layers of time we can barely comprehend. There was an age when giants walked, when creatures so massive roamed this planet that their shadows could eclipse entire valleys, when the very air trembled with their breathing. We live now in their absence, in the quiet spaces they left behind, but their echoes remain, fossilized in rock, crystallized in amber, whispered through the wind that still carries molecules they once exhaled. To walk among giants would mean to reconsider everything. The meaning of safety, of shelter, of significance itself. Your heartbeat would quicken not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming realization that you exist in a scale of life far grander than your daily existence suggests. Each step would be a negotiation with gravity, each breath a reminder that the air itself once supported forms of life your lungs were never designed to imagine sharing space with. The ground would tell stories your feet could feel, vibrations from creatures whose weight pressed footprints deep enough to become lakes, whose movements carved paths that rivers would later follow. You would walk in these ancient highways, following routes mapped not by human hands but by the simple physics of enormous bodies moving through landscapes that bent to accommodate them. But perhaps the most profound shift would be in your perception of time itself. In a world of giants, moments stretch differently. The beat of a massive heart echoes like distant thunder, each pulse marking time in rhythms your own small heart could never match. The giants moved slowly, not because they were lazy, but because their size demanded a different relationship with duration, with the patient unfolding of action across minutes, hours, days that meant something entirely different when filtered through bodies measured in tons rather than pounds. Standing beneath such creatures, you would understand viscerally what it means to be temporary. Your human lifespan, already brief in the context of geological time, would feel like a single breath in the presence of beings whose lives unfolded across decades, whose growth alone spanned years. Yet in that humbling recognition, there might also be a strange comfort, the knowledge that you are part of a continuity larger than yourself, connected to forms of life that pushed the very boundaries of what biology allowed. The silence between their movements would be different too, not the absence of sound, but the presence of space so vast that sound itself had room to expand, to resonate, to carry meanings your ears struggle to decode. You would learn to listen not just with your hearing but with your whole body, feeling the subtle shifts in air pressure that announced approach, the deeper harmonics that spoke of mass and momentum beyond your everyday experience. And in those moments of stillness, when even the giants paused in their ancient routines, you might sense something else, the patient intelligence of creatures who had learned to navigate a world where every action carried consequence, where the simple act of lying down to rest could reshape the landscape, where existence itself required a kind of mindfulness your smaller, more frantic species has largely forgotten. This is where our journey begins, in the space between imagination and evidence, in the recognition that the earth beneath our feet has hosted forms of life that challenge every assumption we hold about what is possible, what is normal, what is home. The giants are gone now, their kingdoms dissolved into sediment and stone, but their presence lingers in ways both subtle and profound, waiting for us to remember what it means to live in a world designed for something far larger, far older, and far more mysterious than ourselves. And yet as we stand here in their absence, we must ask, what forces could have shaped a world where such giants were not anomalies but the natural order of things? What forces could have shaped a world where such giants were not anomalies but the natural order of things? The answer lies not in the creatures themselves but in the canvas upon which they were painted, a planet so fundamentally different from our own, that the very air, the soil, the rhythm of seasons conspired to make gigantism not just possible but inevitable. Imagine breathing air so rich with oxygen, that every inhalation fills your lungs with an almost intoxicating abundance. The atmosphere of deep time held concentrations of oxygen, that would make our modern air feel thin, starved, insufficient. 35% oxygen compared to our current 21%. A difference that sounds modest until you consider what it means for metabolism, for energy, for the very limits of what living tissue can accomplish. In such an atmosphere, cells could burn brighter, hearts could pump harder, and the fundamental equation between size and survival shifted toward the monumental. This was Earth's gift to its children, an atmospheric inheritance that funded growth on a scale our modern world cannot support. The planet's lungs were young then, filled with the exhalations of vast forests that had not yet learned the discipline of efficiency. Trees grew with a wasteful abundance, pumping oxygen into skies that had room for such generosity, creating a feedback loop where abundance bred abundance, where the very act of breathing became an invitation to grow larger, stronger, more magnificent. But oxygen was only part of the recipe. The climate itself moved to rhythms we can barely recognize, guided by continental configurations that have since drifted apart like pieces of a broken center. Pangaea was still whole, or recently fractured, creating weather patterns that painted the globe with broad strokes of warmth and humidity. There were no polar ice caps to lock away the planet's water, no frozen boundaries to limit where life could flourish. Instead, warmth spread like a patient tide, reaching into latitudes that now know only cold, creating greenhouse conditions that nurtured growth across landscapes we can only reconstruct from stone. The carbon cycle sang a different song then, one of accumulation rather than the careful balance we know today. Forests of tree ferns and primitive conifers built cathedrals of carbon, pulling the element from the air and weaving it into structures that would eventually become the coal seams we mine today. But in their time, these forests were living monuments to excess, to a world where photosynthesis operated without the constraints that would later limit plant growth, where the very act of being green was an act of planetary transformation. Geology itself was an active partner in this symphony of size. Volcanic activity painted the skies with minerals that would settle into soils rich enough to support root systems spanning acres, deep enough to anchor trees that reached toward clouds hanging low and heavy with moisture. The Earth's crust moved with a restlessness that brought nutrients to the surface, that created shallow seas where marine life could experiment with forms we now find only in fossils, that built mountain ranges whose erosion would feed valleys where giants could graze. The magnetic field was stronger then, or perhaps just different, creating an envelope of protection that allowed life to venture into experiments with size that our current planetary conditions cannot sustain. Radiation levels, atmospheric pressure, the very tilt of the planet's axis, all conspired to create windows of possibility that opened onto landscapes where being large was not a liability, but an advantage, where the physics of existence favored the massive over the modern. Time itself moved differently across this ancient blueprint. Seasons unfolded with the patience of a world that had not yet learned urgency, where the gradual accumulation of size could proceed without the interruptions of ice ages, without the sudden reversals that would later teach life the value of staying small, staying flexible, staying ready to disappear. The deep time of the giants was measured not in the frantic cycles we know, but in the slow breathing of a planet still young enough to experiment with extreme. This was the stage set for giants, not by accident, but by the fundamental architecture of a world whose chemistry, climate and geology aligned to make the impossible seem inevitable. Every breath of that ancient air, every drop of those warm seas, every grain of that mineral-rich soil was an invitation written in the language of physics and biology, calling life toward forms that would push against every boundary except the ones that truly matter. And in that oxygen-rich atmosphere, creatures began to answer the call, growing wings that would dwarf the birds we know today. And in that oxygen-rich atmosphere, creatures began to answer the call, growing wings that would dwarf the birds we know today. Picture, if you can, the moment when a dragonfly the size of a hawk first lifted from the surface of a carboniferous swamp, its wings beating with a rhythm that would create wind, its shadow passing over landscapes where every living thing existed on a scale that seems borrowed from dreams. These were not simply large insects, they were architects of a different physics, creatures whose very existence rewrote the rules governing what wings could accomplish, what blood could carry, what muscles could sustain. A dragonfly with a wingspan stretching 30 inches across, wider than most eagles, broader than the reach of your arms, navigating through air so rich with oxygen that flight became less a battle against gravity, and more a dance with abundance. Feel for a moment what it might be like to breathe that ancient air. Each inhalation would flood your cells with an energy you've never known, a saturation that would make your heart race not from exertion but from the simple luxury of having more fuel than your body knows how to process. Your blood would carry oxygen like a river in flood, delivering power to muscles that could suddenly accomplish feats that seem impossible under our modern sky. You might find yourself able to run further, think more clearly, exist with an intensity that our 21% atmosphere simply cannot support. But this abundance came with its own requirement. In a world where every breath was a gift of hyperoxidation, only creatures built for such intensity could survive. The giants of the air, those dragonflies with their crystalline wings, those mayflies with bodies thick as your thumb, were not accidents but inevitabilities, the natural result of physics meeting opportunity in an atmosphere that had room for such experiment. The air itself remembers those days, though not in ways we typically think of memory. Trapped in amber, we find bubbles of ancient atmosphere, tiny time capsules that preserve the very breath of those vanished worlds. When scientists crack open these golden prisons, they release air that once filled the lungs of creatures whose names we can only guess at, whose existence we can only reconstruct from shadows left in stone. What stories might that air tell if we could listen carefully enough? It carries isotopes that speak of volcanic seasons when the sky rained minerals, of forest fires that burned with colors we've never seen because they consumed wood from trees that no longer exist. It holds the chemical signatures of a world where photosynthesis operated at an efficiency that modern plants can only dream of, where the very act of breathing was participation in a global metabolism that turned entire continents green. Those flying giants moved through air that was almost liquid in its richness, creating currents and pressures that shaped weather patterns we can barely imagine. Their wing beats generated turbulence that could influence cloud formation. Their migrations created atmospheric rivers that carried moisture and heat across distances that spanned what we now call different time zones. They were not just inhabitants of their atmosphere, they were participants in its creation, partners in the slow dance between life and climate that would eventually reshape the entire planet. The forests they flew above exhaled oxygen with a generosity that bordered on recklessness, pumping the atmosphere full of a gas that made everything possible but also everything dangerous. Fire, when it came, burned with an intensity that could consume entire ecosystems in hours, creating clearings where new experiments in gigantism could begin. The line between creation and destruction blurred in an atmosphere so rich that both proceeded at speeds we associate more with explosions than with evolution. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of breathing that ancient air was the way it altered perception itself. In an oxygen-rich environment, neural activity intensifies, thoughts move faster, awareness expands. Those giant dragonflies with their compound eyes the size of dinner plates might have seen not just more clearly but more complete, processing visual information with an acuity that turned hunting into an art form, navigation into a kind of distributed intelligence that spanned entire watersheds. The memory of that atmosphere lingers still, encoded not just in fossil air, but in the genetic templates that govern how modern insects breathe, how their circulatory systems distribute oxygen, how their wings generate. Every dragonfly that hovers above a modern pond carries within its cells the instructions for growing large, for breathing deep, for flying with the confidence of a creature designed for skies that once welcomed giants. But the air was only the medium. Below those oxygen-drunk skies, ancient oceans harbored mysteries that would make even the flying giants seem modest in comparison. But the air was only the medium. Below those oxygen-drunk skies, ancient oceans harbored mysteries that would make even the flying giants seem modest in comparison. Descend with me slowly, into waters that have not existed for millions of years, where the boundary between the possible and the mythological dissolved like salt in an endless sea. Here ammonites spiraled through the depths like living galaxies, their shells coiled in mathematics that would later inspire human architects, their tentacles reaching through water that was warmer, more mineral-rich, more alive than anything our modern oceans remember. Some of these cephalopods grew shells, 6 feet across, wheels of calcified geometry that housed creatures whose intelligence we can only glimpse through the perfection of their fossilized forms. They were not simply large, they were monuments to a different way of being, proof that the ocean once had room for thoughts that unfolded across tentacles longer than telephone poles, eyes that could focus on prey from distances measured in city blocks. But even the greatest ammonites were dwarfed by the reptiles that came to rule these ancient seas. Imagine, if you can,
floating in water where something the length of a city bus might pass beneath you, its shadow blotting out the filtered sunlight that reached down through depths that seemed designed for hiding Leviathan. These were not whales. Whales had not yet been invented by evolution's patient hand. These were something else entirely, reptiles that had returned to the sea and discovered that water could support forms of life that the land would never tolerate. Plesiosaurs moved through these waters with necks that could extend like living periscopes, reaching up from bodies hidden in the depths to survey surfaces that rippled with possibility. Their necks alone stretched longer than most modern boats, flexible enough to strike in directions their prey could never anticipate, patient enough to remain motionless for hours while lesser creatures swam unknowingly within range. They were hunters, but hunters who operated on a scale that transformed patience into a kind of geological force, waiting not minutes but seasons for the perfect moment to strike. The water itself was different then, not just warmer but structured in ways that supported such massive life. Currents moved with the predictability of rivers, carrying nutrients in concentrations that could feed creatures whose metabolisms would bankrupt any modern ecosystem. Plankton bloomed in densities that turned entire oceanic regions into living soup, thick enough to support food chains that culminated in predators whose appetites were measured not in pounds but in tons of flesh consumed each day. These were oceans where chemistry and biology had reached agreements that no longer exist, where dissolved minerals created water dense enough to support shells that would crack under their own weight in our modern sea, where temperature gradients generated currents strong enough to carry creatures weighing as much as locomotives across distances that spanned continents. The very physics of floating was different, more forgiving, more generous to forms of life that pushed against every boundary except the ones that mattered. Mosasaurs patrolled these waters like living submarines, their skulls alone stretching 6 feet in length, their jaws hinged with a flexibility that allowed them to swallow prey whole, prey that might itself be larger than most animals alive today. They moved with the efficiency of creatures born to water that was deep enough, rich enough, patient enough to support predators whose hunting ranges encompassed areas larger than modern countries. The silence of these ancient depths was not empty but full of the low-frequency calls of creatures whose voices could travel for hundreds of miles through water that carried sound with a clarity our modern oceans have forgotten. Whale song, when it finally evolved, would be a whisper compared to the communications that passed between creatures whose very size demanded a different relationship with sound, with distance, with the patient art of finding one another, across oceanic expanses that dwarfed anything we know today. And in the deepest places where pressure created environments that existed nowhere else on Earth, creatures grew that we have never found, that left no fossils because their bones were cartilage, their bodies too soft to survive the compression of geological time. We know they existed only through the traces they left, bite marks on fossilized bones too large to belong to any predator we've discovered, scratches on sea floors that suggest movement patterns too vast to fit any creature in our fossil record. These oceans were laboratories where evolution experimented with forms that would never again be possible, where the fundamental equations between size, buoyancy and survival produced answers that seem almost mathematical in their perfection. Every creature was part of a complex calculation that balanced energy expenditure against the abundance of resources, that matched hunting strategies to prey densities, that created ecosystems stable enough to support predators whose individual lifespans might stretch across centuries. But above these teeming depths, on lands that were still learning how to support weight beyond imagining, forests grew that would make even the ocean giants seem proportionate to their environment. But above these teeming depths, on lands that were still learning how to support weight beyond imagining, forests grew that would make even the ocean giants seem proportionate to their environment. Step carefully into these groves where every fern frond spreads wider than a dinner table, where tree trunks rise like the pillars of cathedrals that have no ceiling except the sky itself, where the simple act of walking requires navigation through a landscape designed for beings whose height was measured in stories rather than feet. These were not forests as we understand them, collections of individual trees competing for light and space. These were living architectures, ecosystems where plants had learned to build upward with an ambition that seems almost geological in scope. Lepidodendron trees, scale trees, we call them now, rose over 100 feet into air so humid it was almost liquid, their trunks thick enough that a dozen people holding hands could not encircle them, their bark patterned with diamond-shaped scars that recorded years of growth we can barely comprehend. Imagine trying to find your way through such a forest. The canopy above you would be so dense, so distant, that sunlight would reach the forest floor in scattered coins of gold. each beam precious enough that entire communities of smaller plants would organize themselves around these brief illumination. You would walk in a perpetual twilight, navigating between root systems that formed natural highways, following paths carved not by human feet but by the patient pressure of plants that had learned to make room for each other in their reach toward light. The silence here would be different from any silence you know, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a quiet so deep it seemed to have weight. When wind moved through the canopy so far above, it would reach your ears as a whisper that carried the voices of leaves larger than your body, the creaking of wood thick enough to build ships from single branch. Occasionally the forest would speak more directly, the crash of a falling fern frond the size of a small tree, the distant splash of moisture condensing and falling like rain from vegetation so vast it generated its own weather. This was a world where photosynthesis operated on an industrial scale, where individual leaves captured sunlight in quantities that could power entire modern ecosystems. The ferns especially, tree ferns with crowns that spread like living umbrellas, their fronds unfurling in spirals that followed mathematical principles we still study today, transformed these forests into solar collectors of unprecedented efficiency. Each frond was a factory, each cell a furnace burning carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen with a productivity that gradually transformed the planet's entire atmosphere. The soil beneath your feet would feel different too, spongy with the accumulated decay of plant matter that fell in quantities measured in tons per acre each year. This was organic matter so rich, so densely packed with nutrients that it would eventually become the coal seams we mine today. You would be walking on what future geology would call the Carboniferous period's greatest gift to humanity, forests so productive, so abundant, that their decomposition would fuel industrial civilization hundreds of millions of years in the future. But in their time, these forests were simply home to creatures that had learned to navigate verticality on a scale that required new forms of consciousness. Insects the size of small birds moved through the understory, their chitinous bodies reflecting light that filtered down through layers of vegetation thick enough to create their own climate zone. Spiders with leg spans measured in feet constructed webs between tree trunks, creating aerial highways where predation operated according to geometries that would make modern arachnids seem almost modern. The trees themselves were experiments in engineering that pushed against the fundamental limits of what wood and water could accomplish together. Their vascular systems, the networks of tubes that carried nutrients from roots to leaves, operated on scales that required innovations in plant physiology we still don't fully understand. How do you pump water over 100 feet vertically using only the patient pressure of transpiration? How do you build wood strong enough to support such height while remaining flexible enough to bend with winds that could snap smaller trees like twigs? These forests were also communities in ways that transcended our modern understanding of ecological relation. The largest trees were not simply individuals but ecosystems unto themselves, their bark hosting gardens of smaller plants, their hollows sheltering creatures whose entire life cycles unfolded in the space between trunk and outer world. Symbiosis operated on scales that blurred the boundaries between organism and environment, between individual and community, between forest and single living entity. And in the quiet spaces between these giants, smaller creatures went about their lives in the perpetual twilight of a world where being small meant existing in the spaces that largeness could not fill. They were the inheritors of shadows, the specialists in navigating between rather than over, around rather than through. Their existence was proof that even in an age of giants, there remained niches for the modest, roles for creatures whose survival strategy was not to grow large but to grow clever, adaptable, patient. But all of this abundance, this experimentation with scale and form, left traces that speak to us still, whispers preserved in stone, echoes frozen in time, stories written in the language of geology itself. But all of this abundance, this experimentation with scale and form, left traces that speak to us still, whispers preserved in stone, echoes frozen in time, stories written in the language of geology itself. Fossils are not simply the remains of ancient life, they are libraries, archives, museums of moments when flesh became mineral, when the temporary became eternal, when the story of giants was written in a script that time itself cannot completely erase. Hold a fossil in your hands, and you are touching time made tangible. That bone, now turned to stone through processes, so patient they span millions of years, once carried blood that pumped through arteries thick enough to swim through. Those minerals that now compose its structure, calcium, phosphorus, traces of iron and magnesium, were once the living chemistry of a creature, whose heartbeat shook the ground, whose breathing moved air in volumes we measure today, only in industrial terms. But fossils speak in languages more subtle than simple preservation. The isotopes locked within fossilized bone tell stories of climate, of diet, of seasonal changes that played out across landscapes we can only reconstruct from evidence scattered across continents. Oxygen isotopes whisper of ancient temperatures, of ice ages and greenhouse periods that created the boundary conditions within which giants could exist or must perish. Carbon isotopes reveal food webs of staggering complexity, where predators and prey operated on scales that required entire ecosystems to support single individuals. Consider the fossilized vertebra of a sauropod, a single bone from the spine of a creature that stretched from here to the far end of a football field. Within that bone's mineral matrix lie the chemical signatures of every meal that creature ever ate, every seasonal migration that carried it across continents, every drought and plenty that shaped its growth from hatchling to monument. The bone is a chronicle, written in elements that persist long after flesh has returned to the carbon cycle from which it came. Even more remarkably, some fossils preserve not just structure, but behavior, footprints pressed into mud that hardened into stone, trackways that record the passage of creatures whose stride length reveals not just size but speed, not just presence but purpose. Follow these ancient highways and you can reconstruct moments, a predator stalking prey across distances measured in miles, a herd moving in formation through landscapes where safety lay only in numbers and vigilance. The delicate negotiations between creatures large enough to reshape their environment, simply by existing within it. The process of fossilization itself is a form of alchemy, a transformation that occurs only under conditions so specific, so unlikely, that most life leaves no trace at all. For every fossil we find, thousands of creatures lived and died without leaving any evidence of their existence, except the nutrients their decay contributed to the ecosystems that followed. The fossils we discover represent not typical life but extraordinary death, creatures that died in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, under exactly the right conditions to become stone rather than soil.
Some fossils preserve details so fine they seem almost photographic impressions of skin texture that reveal whether a creature was smooth or scaled, feathered or furred, adapted for water or land or the transitional spaces between. Others capture final moments with a clarity that collapses the millions of years between their time and ours. A small mammal fossilized in the act of giving birth, a fish preserved mid-swallow with its prey still visible in its throat, a flying reptile that fell from the sky and was buried so quickly its wings remained spread in the position of their final flight. The chemistry of preservation varies as dramatically as the creatures preserved. In some cases, the original bone is completely replaced, molecule by molecule, with minerals that infiltrated from groundwater over geological timescales. In others, the organic material persists in forms so stable they have survived for hundreds of millions of years. Collagen that still retains its molecular structure, melanosomes that preserve the actual colors of feathers and skin, DNA fragments that carry genetic information across depths of time but boggle the imagination. Perhaps most humbling of all are the trace fossils, the indirect evidence of life, that never fossilized directly but left marks that speak to behaviors, to intelligence, to forms of consciousness we can infer but never directly observe. Coprolites fossilized dung reveal digestive systems processing plant and animal matter in quantities that required entire food webs to sustain. Burrows preserve evidence of creatures that lived underground, creating tunnel systems complex enough to suggest social organization, planning, forms of cooperation that challenge our assumptions about ancient intelligence. Each fossil site is a crime scene written in stone, a mystery that requires detective work spanning multiple scientific disciplines to solve. Paleontologists become archaeologists of deep time, reconstructing not just anatomy but ecology, not just individual creatures but entire worlds. The chemistry of ancient soils reveals precipitation patterns that determined where giants could find water. The distribution of plant fossils maps climates that made gigantism possible or impossible. The association of predator and prey fossils tells stories of evolutionary arms races that played out across millions of years. And yet, even as fossils preserve the evidence of giants, they also reveal the mathematical rules that governed their existence, the physical laws that determined when largeness was advantage and when it became liability. And yet, even as fossils preserve the evidence of giants, they also reveal the mathematical rules that governed their existence, the physical laws that determined when largeness was advantage and when it became liability. There are equations written into the fabric of biology itself,
Formulas that govern the relationship between mass and metabolism, between size and survival, between the ambitions of life and the constraints of physics. Consider the square-cube law, that elegant mathematical principle that explains why giants cannot exist without consequence. As any creature grows larger, its surface area increases by the square of its dimensions, but its volume and therefore its mass increases by the cube. This means that a creature twice as tall as another will be 4 times as wide but 8 times as heavy. The implications cascade through every aspect of biology. Bones must become proportionally thicker to support exponentially greater weight. Hearts must pump blood through circulatory systems that stretch across increasingly vast distances. Lungs must process oxygen for bodies whose metabolic demands grow faster than their ability to acquire resources. This is why the giants of the past required such specific conditions to exist. In our modern world, with its 21% oxygen atmosphere, an insect the size of those ancient dragonflies would suffocate before it could take flight. Their respiratory systems, networks of tubes that carry oxygen directly to tissues, simply cannot scale up proportionally. The distance from the surface to the interior becomes too great, the diffusion too slow, the physics too unforgiving. But in an atmosphere with 35% oxygen, these limitations dissolve. The air itself becomes rich enough to support the metabolic fires that gigantism requires. Gravity, too, writes its own limits into the possible. Every creature must negotiate with the patient pull of Earth's mass, must build skeletons strong enough to support their own weight without becoming so heavy they cannot move. The largest dinosaurs walked a tightrope between structural integrity and mobility, their bones hollowed in patterns that would inspire modern aerospace engineers, their bodies designed according to principles that balance strength against mass with a precision that seems almost intentional. But the rules of size extend beyond simple physics into the more complex territories of ecology and evolution. Large creatures require large ranges, vast territories to support their equally vast metabolism. They reproduce slowly, invest enormous resources in offspring that take years or decades to mature, exist in population densities so low that finding mates becomes a significant challenge. When environmental conditions change, their size becomes a liability. They cannot hide, cannot adapt quickly, cannot exist on the modest resources that might sustain smaller creatures through periods of scarcity. The mathematics of heat loss and heat production create additional constraints. Large bodies generate heat proportional to their volume but lose it proportional to their surface area. This means giants face constant thermal challenges, overheating in warm climates, requiring massive food intake to maintain body temperature in cold ones. Their very size traps them within narrow ranges of comfortable temperature, makes them vulnerable to climate changes that smaller, more adaptable creatures might weather with ease. Metabolism, too, follows mathematical laws that giants cannot escape. The rate at which creatures burn energy scales not directly with their size but according to more complex relationships that favor efficiency in smaller bodies. A giant may eat 100 times more than a smaller creature, but accomplish only 10 times as much work. The economics of existence become increasingly challenging as size increases, requiring environmental conditions rich enough to support what amounts to biological waste on an enormous scale. Yet there are also advantages that scale provides, mathematical benefits that can outweigh the costs under the right conditions. Large size confers thermal stability, big bodies change temperature slowly, providing buffer against environmental fluctuation. It offers protection against predation. Few creatures can threaten something dramatically larger than themselves. It enables access to resources unavailable to smaller competitors. Tall browsers can reach foliage beyond the reach of shorter rivals. Large predators can take prey that would be impossible for smaller hunters to subdue. The fossil record reveals that life has repeatedly experimented with these equations, testing the boundaries of what size can accomplish under different environmental conditions. When climates were stable, resources abundant, and competition limited, evolution pushed toward gigantism. When conditions became challenging, resources scarce, or environments unpredictable, the advantage shifted towards smaller, more flexible forms. Perhaps most remarkably, the mathematics of size creates feedback loops that can amplify or constrain growth across entire ecosystems. Large herbivores require abundant vegetation, which requires stable climate and rich soils, which may be maintained partly by the presence of large herbivores whose grazing and fertilization create conditions favorable to plant growth. Large predators require abundant large prey, which requires vast territories and stable food webs which may depend on the very presence of large predators to maintain balance. These mathematical relationships help explain why giants tend to appear and disappear together, why the fossil record shows periods when enormous creatures dominated across multiple groups, followed by epochs when life operated on more modest scale. The equations that govern size are interconnected, creating windows of opportunity when gigantism becomes not just possible but inevitable, and periods when the mathematics of survival favor the small, the quick, the adaptable. But nowhere were these equations more dramatically tested than in the age when the largest land animals ever to walk the earth ruled landscapes that stretched across entire continents. But nowhere were these equations more dramatically tested than in the age when the largest land animals ever to walk the earth ruled landscapes that stretched across entire continents. The Mesozoic era, the time of the dinosaurs, represents evolution's most ambitious experiment with size, a period when the mathematical constraints that limit gigantism were pushed to their absolute limits, and sometimes beyond, creating creatures so large they seem to challenge our understanding of what biology can accomplish. Imagine standing in the shadow of Argentinosaurus, a creature whose weight approached that of a dozen African elephants, whose neck could reach heights that would require a ladder to approach, whose footsteps left impressions deep enough that smaller animals could shelter in them during rainstorms. This was not simply a large animal, this was a living mountain, a creature whose existence required the reorganization of entire ecosystems around the simple fact of its presence. Every step redistributed tons of soil, every feeding session cleared acres of vegetation, every movement created disturbances that rippled through food webs like stones dropped into still water. The sauropods, those long-necked giants that have become the icons of dinosaur enormity, solved the engineering problems of gigantism with innovations that still inspire wonder. Their necks, stretching up to 50 feet in length, were not solid columns of bone and muscle but delicate constructions of hollow vertebrae, air-filled spaces and pneumatic systems that made them light enough to lift while strong enough to support their own weight. They were biological cranes, evolved machines for reaching resources that no other creatures could access. But the true marvel of sauropod engineering lay not in their necks but in their hearts, organs that had to pump blood across distances and elevations that would challenge modern hydraulic systems, blood pressure requirements that would kill most mammals, circulation that had to overcome gravitational head pressures, measured in stories, hearts that may have been compound organs, multiple chambers working in coordination to achieve what single hearts could never accomplish. They were living experiments in cardiovascular engineering, testing the limits of what biological pumps could achieve. Their digestive systems operated on scales that transformed eating into geology. Sauropods were living composters, processing hundreds of pounds of plant matter daily through guts that stretched for dozens of feet, fermenting vegetation in stomach chambers, large enough to hold automobiles. The heat generated by their digestion could warm their enormous bodies. The gases produced could influence local atmospheric chemistry. The waste products could fertilize territories measured in square miles. Yet even the sauropods were not the most remarkable examples of dinosaur gigantism. The predators that evolved to hunt them pushed the mathematics of carnivory into territories that seem almost absurd. Giganotosaurus, Carcharodontosaurus, Spinosaurus, names that sound like incantations, creatures whose skulls alone were larger than entire modern predators, whose teeth were serrated knives designed for slicing through skin thick as tree bark, muscle dense as stone. These predators faced engineering challenges unknown to any modern carnivore. How do you design jaws powerful enough to penetrate the hide of a creature weighing 80 tons, while maintaining the speed and agility necessary to hunt such prey? How do you build leg muscles capable of accelerating bodies that weigh as much as trucks while maintaining the endurance necessary for pursuits that might span miles? How do you design sensory systems capable of tracking prey across landscapes where the quarry itself could reshape the terrain simply by walking through it? The solutions they evolved were as elegant as they were extreme. Hollow bones reduced weight without sacrificing strength. Pneumatic skull bones created space for muscles while minimizing mass. Serrated teeth that replaced themselves continuously throughout their lives ensured that their primary tools never dulled. Some developed sails or crests that may have functioned as heat exchangers, Biological radiators that helped manage the thermal loads generated by bodies operating at the very limits of what metabolism could sustain. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the dinosaur giants was not their size but their success. The fact that they dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 160 million years, a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of human civilization. They were not evolutionary failures but evolutionary triumphs, proof that under the right conditions, gigantism could be not just sustainable but dominant. The Mesozoic world was their world, shaped by their presence, organized around their needs, calibrated to their scale. The climate that supported them was a masterpiece of stability, warm, humid, without polar ice caps, with atmospheric composition that favored large-bodied life. Carbon dioxide levels created greenhouse conditions that supported vegetation productive enough to fuel metabolisms that operated on industrial scale. Ocean currents distributed heat evenly enough that seasonal variations were modest, predictable, manageable by creatures whose size made rapid adaptation impossible. But this stability contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very success of the dinosaur giants created ecosystems so specialized, so finely tuned to their presence, that they became vulnerable to disruptions that smaller, more flexible creatures might survive. When the mathematics of survival suddenly changed, when the equations that had favored largeness for millions of years were rewritten in a matter of decades, the giants found themselves trapped by their own success, prisoners of adaptations that had made them masters of a world that no longer existed. And then came the silence, a hush so profound, so complete, that it reset the biological clock of an entire planet. And then came the silence, a hush so profound, so complete, that it reset the biological clock of an entire planet. The asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs struck with a force that transformed sound itself, creating a moment of impact so violent it temporarily deafened the Earth, followed by a stillness heavy enough to smother ecosystems that had thrived for over 100. Picture the moment, a chunk of rock and metal perhaps 6 miles across, traveling at speeds that turned its approach into a kind of cosmic violence, carrying kinetic energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. When it struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, it created a crater over 100 miles wide. Vaporized rock in quantities measured in cubic miles, sent shockwaves racing around the globe at velocities that outpaced sound, outpaced thought, outpaced everything except the patient chemistry of destruction itself. The immediate aftermath was chaos written in physics. Tsunamis hundreds of feet tall racing across shallow seas, forests, igniting from debris heated to incandescence, earthquakes powerful enough to trigger volcanic eruptions on the opposite side of the planet. But these spectacular destructions were merely the prelude to something more subtle and more devastating, the gradual settling of a darkness that would persist for months, perhaps years, turning day into twilight and twilight into a darkness deeper than any night the living Earth had ever known. Dust and debris launched into the stratosphere by the impact's violence created a shroud that blocked sunlight across entire continents. Temperatures plummeted not gradually but suddenly, transforming tropical paradises into landscapes, cold enough to kill creatures whose size had made them prisoners of their own thermal requirements. The giants, with their massive bodies that changed temperature slowly, found themselves trapped in a physics they could not escape, too large to generate heat quickly, too specialized to survive on the meager resources that remained available in a world where photosynthesis had essentially stopped. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this new world was not the cold or the darkness, but the silence that accompanied them. The great migrations ceased. There was nowhere to migrate to in a world where every landscape had become equally inhospitable. The calls that had once carried across continents, the communications between creatures whose social lives had spanned territories larger than modern countries, simply stopped. The Earth fell silent in ways it had never been silent before, as if the impact had struck not just the planet's surface but the very possibility of large-scale life itself. In this stillness, ecosystems collapsed according to mathematical principles that favored the small over the large, the simple over the complex, the adaptable over the specialized. Food webs that had taken millions of years to construct unraveled in decades. Creatures that had evolved to eat specific plants found themselves starving as those plants died in the artificial winter. Predators that had specialized in hunting particular prey discovered that their prey had vanished, leaving them with skills perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. The fossil record preserves this transition with a sharpness that speaks to its speed. Below what geologists call the KPG boundary, the thin layer of clay that marks the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Paleogene, we find the bones of giants. Above it, we find mainly the remains of creatures, small enough to survive on seeds, hardy enough to weather years of environmental chaos, flexible enough to adapt to resources that appeared and disappeared according to no patterns. Their evolution had prepared them to understand. Yet this silence was not empty but pregnant with possibility. In the spaces left vacant by the giants, in the niches abandoned by the specialized, life began a new set of experiments. The mammals, tiny creatures that had lived in the shadows of dinosaur feet for over 100 million years, found themselves inheriting a world where smallness was suddenly an advantage, where the ability to survive on modest resources was more valuable than the ability to process vast quantities of food. The silence after impact was also a silence of opportunity. Without the giants to crop vegetation, forests began to grow in new patterns, creating environments that had never existed in the shadow of sauropod herds. Without the large predators to impose order through fear, herbivore communities reorganized according to principles that emphasized cooperation over competition, efficiency over dominance. The absence of the giants created space for experiments in social organization, in intelligence, in forms of adaptation that gigantism had made unnecessary or impossible. Even the atmosphere began to change in the absence of creatures whose breathing had operated on industrial scale. Oxygen levels, carbon dioxide concentrations, the chemical composition of air itself shifted, as ecosystems learned to function without the metabolic contributions of creatures whose individual respirations had influenced regional climate. The silence was not just acoustic but chemical, a pause in the planetary metabolism that had been shaped by giant lungs for geological ages. This was extinction as opportunity, destruction as creation, silence as the prelude to new forms of sound. The crater left by the impact would eventually become part of the landscape, its rim softened by erosion, its interior filled with sediments that would preserve the story of what came after. But the larger crater, the absence left by the giants in the structure of life itself, would be filled by experiments that pushed evolution in entirely new direction. And in that evolutionary laboratory created by absence, some forms of gigantism would survive, though not in the places or forms that anyone might have expected. And in that evolutionary laboratory created by absence, some forms of gigantism would survive, though not in the places or forms that anyone might have expected. Look closely at the world that emerged from the silence, and you will find that the age of giants did not truly end. It simply learned to hide in smaller packages, to preserve its ambitions in forms humble enough to survive catastrophe, clever enough to inherit the earth through persistence rather than dominance. Consider the birds, those living dinosaurs whose wings carry the genetic memory of creatures that once shook the ground with their footsteps. In the hollow bones of a sparrow you can trace the engineering innovations that once supported sauropod nests. In the respiratory system of a pigeon, you can find the pneumatic efficiency that allowed pterosaurs to achieve powered flight despite wingspans that stretched wider than small aircraft. The birds are not simply descendants of dinosaurs, they are dinosaurs compressed and refined, edited by extinction into forms that could survive the mathematics of catastrophe. Their beaks preserve the specialization that once characterized dinosaur diversity. The seed-cracking bill of a finch recalls the bone-crushing jaws of tyrannosaurs, scaled down and repurposed for a world where power was measured in grams rather than tons. The probing bill of a hummingbird echoes the delicate feeding apparatus of small theropods, maintaining precision while abandoning mass. Each species of bird carries within its anatomy a different solution to the problem of being large in a world that suddenly favored the small. Even their migrations preserve something of the continental scale movements that once characterized dinosaur herds. When Arctic terns travel from pole to pole, when bar-tailed godwits fly non-stop across entire oceans, they are following navigation principles, inherited from ancestors whose migrations spanned continents, whose seasonal movements required the coordination of creatures whose individual weights could have crushed the birds that now inherit their. But birds were not the only survivors to carry forward the ambitions of gigantism in miniature form. Crocodilians, those living fossils whose basic body plan has remained essentially unchanged for over 200 million years, preserve in their modern forms the blueprint of creatures that once ruled waterways from pole to pole. The largest crocodiles today, saltwater crocodiles that can exceed 20 feet in length, are direct heirs to ancestors that grew twice as large, that hunted dinosaurs along riverbanks that no longer exist. In their patient stillness, modern crocodiles embody survival strategies that allowed their lineage to weather not just the asteroid impact but multiple mass extinction. They are generalists disguised as specialists, capable of surviving for months without food, of regulating their metabolism according to environmental conditions, of growing continuously throughout lifespans that can span centuries. They are giants compressed into forms modest enough to persist, patient enough to wait through ages of scarcity for opportunities to expand. Turtles, too, carry forward ancient solutions to the engineering problems of large size. Their shells preserve structural innovations first developed when the world was young enough to support creatures whose protection came not from speed or camouflage, but from armor thick enough to deflect the attacks of predators that no longer exist. The largest sea turtles today, leatherbacks whose shells can span 6 feet, are echoes of ancestors that grew large enough to share beaches with dinosaurs. The developed navigation systems capable of guiding migrations across oceans that were fundamentally different from modern sea. Perhaps most remarkably, these survivors carry forward not just physical innovations, but behavioral adaptations that speak to intelligence, to social organization, to forms of consciousness that we are only beginning to understand. The complex social hierarchies of the sophisticated communication systems of crocodilian communities, the navigation abilities that allow turtles to return to specific beaches after decades wandering ocean basins. These are not simply instincts but inherited wisdom, solutions to survival problems first developed when the world was large enough to require thinking on continental scales. The fossil record suggests that survival through the Great Extinction was not random, but followed patterns that favored certain approaches to existence. Creatures that could enter dormancy, that required minimal resources during periods of scarcity, that maintained broad dietary flexibility. These were the inheritors of a simplified world, but they carried within their compressed forms the accumulated innovations of the Age of Giants, ready to expand when conditions again favored largeness. Some did expand, though in environments and forms that the original giants could never have imagined. The largest birds that ever lived, terror birds with skulls the size of horses, flightless predators that ruled South American ecosystems for millions of years after the dinosaur extinction, represented experiments in terrestrial gigantism that pushed against the same engineering constraints their ancestors had faced. They were proof that the impulse toward largeness had not died but had learned patience, had developed the ability to wait through catastrophes for opportunities to reassert itself. These survivors in miniature carry forward more than just anatomical innovations. They preserve behavioral adaptations, social structures, forms of intelligence that were first developed in a world where thinking had to operate on scales we can barely imagine. They are libraries of extinct wisdom, genetic museums preserving solutions to problems that may someday become relevant again when the Earth's cycles once more favor the large, the ambitious, the magnificently oversized. But the most dramatic experiments in post-extinction gigantism would emerge not on land but in the very oceans that had once sheltered the largest marine reptiles ever known. But the most dramatic experiments in post-extinction gigantism would emerge not on land but in the very oceans that had once sheltered the largest marine reptiles ever known. Here in the three-dimensional freedom of salt water, evolution would discover that the Age of Giants need not end, but could simply relocate, could find new expressions in forms that pushed the boundaries of what mammalian biology could accomplish in the fluid embrace of the sea. Whales represent perhaps the most remarkable transformation in the history of life, terrestrial mammals that returned to the ocean, and in doing so rediscovered the mathematical advantages of gigantism that water alone can provide. The blue whale, largest creature ever known to have lived, exceeds even the most massive dinosaurs in sheer bulk, its heart alone weighing as much as a small car, its tongue heavier than an elephant, its body stretching to lengths that require football fields for proper visualization. But blue whales are not simply large mammals that happen to live in water, they are evolutionary solutions to problems that only the ocean can pose, and only oceanic physics can solve. Their size is not accident but adaptation, not excess but efficient. In the three-dimensional hunting grounds of the open ocean, where prey exists in clouds rather than herds, where food sources are scattered across distances measured in thousands of miles, gigantism becomes a strategy for energy conservation, rather than expenditure. Consider the physics of filter feeding at this scale. A blue whale's mouth can engulf volumes of water equivalent to its own body weight, processing tons of krill in single gulps that strain entire ecosystems through baleen filters, fine enough to capture prey organisms, smaller than your thumb. This is predation, operating according to principles that land-based hunters could never employ. The ability to consume entire communities of prey, in individual feeding events, to process biomass at rates that approach industrial scales. Their migrations span ocean basins,
following currents and seasonal patterns that connect polar feeding grounds with tropical breeding areas across distances that encompass entire continents. These are not simply movements but pilgrimages operating on planetary scales, connecting ecosystems, separated by thousands of miles of open water. A blue whale's annual journey may cover distances equivalent to traveling halfway around the Earth, following routes that have remained essentially unchanged for millions of years.
The sounds they produce travel even further than their bodies. Low-frequency calls that can carry across entire ocean basins, communications that connect individuals separated by distances greater than most terrestrial animals travel in their entire lifetimes. Their voices operate at wavelength measured in kilometers, creating acoustic territories that span areas larger than many countries. They are living embodiments of the ocean's scale, creatures whose very existence requires thinking in terms of planetary geography. But whales are not the only ocean giants to emerge from the post-extinction world. Great white sharks, those living submarines whose lineage stretches back to the age of dinosaurs, represent a different approach to marine gigantism. Not the filter-feeding efficiency of whales, but the concentrated lethality of apex predation refined across geological timescale. Their ancestors shared ancient seas with marine reptiles that dwarfed modern whales, and they survived by perfecting rather than abandoning the predatory strategies that had served their lineage through multiple mass extinction. Giant squid, those deep-sea phantoms whose existence was myth until cameras finally captured them in their abyssal territories, represent perhaps the most alien form of modern gigantism. With eyes the size of dinner plates, tentacles that can stretch longer than school buses, and intelligence that operates according to principles we are only beginning to understand, they are proof that the ocean can still support experiments in form and consciousness that push against the boundaries of what we consider possible. These modern ocean giants share characteristics that speak to the unique advantages water provides for large-scale life. Buoyancy negates many of the structural engineering problems that constrain terrestrial giants. The three-dimensional nature of aquatic environments provides access to resources distributed through volumes rather than across surfaces. The thermal stability of large bodies of water buffers against temperature fluctuations that would challenge land-based giants. Most importantly, the ocean provides space, vast continuous habitat where creatures can grow to sizes that would be impossible in the fragmented landscapes that characterize most terrestrial environments. Yet even these modern giants are constrained by the same fundamental equations that have always governed science. Blue whales exist at the very limits of what mammalian physiology can accomplish, their circulatory systems operating at pressures and scales that represent the maximum efficiency evolution has been able to achieve. They are as much monuments to biological engineering as they are living creatures, proof that even in the forgiving environment of the ocean, gigantism remains a negotiation with physics that few forms of life can successfully complete. The ocean's giants also demonstrate how gigantism creates its own vulnerability. Blue whales require vast quantities of krill concentrated in specific locations at specific times, a dependency that makes them vulnerable to changes in ocean chemistry, temperature and current patterns that might not affect smaller, more flexible predators. Their size, which allows them to travel across ocean basins, also makes them vulnerable to human activities that operate on similarly planetary scales. Ship strikes, acoustic pollution, climate change that alters the distribution of their prey. But perhaps most remarkably, these modern ocean giants serve as living bridges connecting us to the age of ancient gigantism, proof that the impulse toward largeness persists in life itself, waiting for opportunities to express itself when conditions allow. They carry in their bodies and behaviors echoes of evolutionary strategies, first developed in seas that were home to creatures we know only from fossils, solutions to survival problems that transcend any particular geological era. And in the rocks beneath those ancient seas, in the sediments that preserve the chemistry of vanished oceans, we can still read the signatures left by giants whose existence we might otherwise never have suspected. And in the rocks beneath those ancient seas, in the sediments that preserve the chemistry of vanished oceans, we can still read the signatures left by giants whose existence we might otherwise never have suspected. The Earth itself is a library written in languages of stone and mineral, where isotopes serve as letters, chemical ratios as words, and the slow accumulation of sediments as sentences that tell stories spanning millions of years. Here the presence of giants is recorded not just in bones and shells but in the very chemistry of the planet they once inhabited. Carbon isotopes locked within limestone layers whisper of photosynthesis operating on scales that modern ecosystems cannot match. Evidence of forests so vast, so productive that their breathing altered the atmospheric composition of the entire planet. When paleontologists crack open rocks from the Carboniferous period, they release the chemical signatures of an atmosphere where oxygen concentrations reached levels that would be toxic to most modern life, but were necessary to support the metabolisms of creatures whose size required industrial-scale energy production. Oxygen isotopes preserve in mineral form the temperatures of ancient seas, recording climate conditions stable enough to support marine reptiles whose lifespans stretched across centuries, whose migrations connected ocean basins that have since moved thousands of miles apart due to continental drift. These isotopic thermometers reveal a world where seasonal temperature variations were so modest that gigantism could develop without the thermal stress that constrains large-bodied life in our more volatile modern climate. Strontium ratios in fossilized shells tell stories of ocean chemistry so different from modern seas that the very process of building calcium carbonate skeletons operated according to principles we struggle to understand. The ammonites, those spiral giants of ancient oceans, constructed their shells in waters where dissolved minerals existed in concentrations that would poison most modern marine life. Their fossils preserve evidence of seas so rich in nutrients that filter feeding could support creatures whose individual appetites rivaled those of modern whales. Trace elements embedded in ancient soils record the passage of sauropod herds whose digestive systems processed plant matter in quantities large enough to alter the mineral composition of entire watersheds. The phosphorus signatures left by their waste products can still be detected in rock layers, evidence of fertilization events that operated on scales comparable to modern industrial agriculture. These chemical fingerprints map territories where individual animals influenced ecosystems across areas measured in thousands of square miles. Even more remarkably, some rocks preserve evidence of behaviors that left no direct fossil trace but altered the chemistry of their environment in ways that persist to this day. Deep ocean sediments contain layers enriched with iron and sulfur compounds that speak to the activities of creatures we have never found, whose metabolisms operated on scales large enough to influence the redox chemistry of entire ocean basins. These chemical ghosts suggest forms of gigantism that exceeded even what the fossil record reveals, creatures whose existence we can infer only from the planetary scale signatures they left in stone. Volcanic ash layers preserve moments when the interaction between geological and biological processes created conditions that either favored or eliminated gigantism across entire continents. The mineral compositions of these ash falls record atmospheric chemistry at moments when ecosystems collapsed or expanded, when the mathematical equations governing size shifted suddenly enough to determine which lineages would survive and which would vanish. These are extinction events written in chemistry, preserved in rock layers thin as paper but comprehensive as library. The isotopic signatures of ancient groundwater, preserved in the mineral matrices of fossilized wood, reveal how the root systems of giant plants altered the chemistry of subsurface environments across entire continents. Tree ferns with root networks spanning acres created underground ecosystems where mineral exchange operated on scales that modern forests cannot approach. Their chemical signatures persist in rocks that formed when these plants were alive, creating maps of ancient root systems more comprehensive than any anatomical fossil could provide. Perhaps most fascinating are the biomineralization patterns preserved in the shells and bones of ancient giants. Under electron microscopes, the crystal structures of fossilized ammonite shells reveal growth patterns that speak to metabolisms operating at rates we associate more with industrial processes than with biological ones. The arrangement of calcium carbonate crystals preserves evidence of shell construction that proceeded continuously throughout lifespans measured in decades or centuries, creating structures whose engineering sophistication rivals modern architectural achievement. Rare earth elements concentrated in fossilized teeth and bones provide chemical fingerprints that allow paleontologists to trace the movements of individual giants across continents and through time. A tyrannosaur tooth contains isotopic signatures that reveal not just what it ate but where it lived at different stages of its life, creating biographical maps of creatures whose individual existence spanned territories larger than modern countries. These chemical biographies connect fossils found thousands of miles apart,
revealing migration patterns and population dynamics that operated on continental scales. The preservation of organic molecules in some fossils extends this chemical library into the realm of biochemistry itself. Proteins extracted from dinosaur bones retain enough structural integrity to reveal metabolic processes that operated according to principles we are only beginning to understand. These molecular fossils preserve evidence of physiological adaptations that allowed gigantism to persist across the temperature ranges and seasonal variations that characterized ancient climate. But reading these chemical libraries requires understanding not just the signatures of giants but the broader patterns of planetary chemistry that made their existence possible. The deep cycles of creation and destruction that operate on time scales that dwarf even the longest-lived individual. But reading these chemical libraries requires understanding not just the signatures of giants but the broader patterns of planetary chemistry that made their existence possible. The deep cycles of creation and destruction that operate on timescales that dwarf even the longest-lived individual. Entropy, that fundamental principle governing the direction of change in all systems, writes its own story through the rise and fall of giants, teaching lessons about the relationship between size, stability, and the patient mathematics of decay. Everything large decays faster, collapses harder, returns to disorder with a violence proportional to its former organization. This is not merely observation but law, a principle encoded in the thermodynamics that govern everything from the cooling of stars to the decomposition of forests to the inevitable dissolution of the most magnificent creatures ever to walk the earth. The giants in their very success carried within themselves the seeds of their own impermanence, the mathematical certainty that their organizational complexity could not persist indefinitely against the steady pressure of entropy's patient work. Consider what happens when a sauropod dies. Its massive body, which required decades to construct from minerals drawn from soil and plants, becomes a temporary disruption in the local ecosystem's energy budget. The decomposition of 40 tons of organic matter creates a chemical explosion that can alter soil composition for miles around, generates heat that affects local weather patterns, releases nutrients in concentrations that can trigger plant growth visible from orbit. Death at this scale becomes a geological event, entropy expressing itself with enough force to reshape landscapes, but entropy operates on temporal scales as well as physical ones. The larger a system becomes, the more energy it requires to maintain its organization against the constant tendency toward disorder. Giant plants must pump water against gravity across distances measured in stories, requiring energy expenditures that increase exponentially with height. Giant animals must coordinate nervous systems that span distances comparable to telephone networks, process information across neural pathways that stretch for yards rather than inches, maintain organizational coherence across volumes of tissue that challenge the very concept of individual identity. The fossil record preserves entropy's lessons with crystalline clarity. Periods of gigantism correlate with environmental stability, times when energy was abundant enough to support the high maintenance costs of large-scale organization, when climate conditions persisted long enough for the slow process of growing large to pay dividends in survival and reproduction. But these same periods of stability contained within themselves the conditions for their own termination. The very success of giants in exploiting environmental resources often altered those environments in ways that eventually made gigantism unsustainable. Giant herbivores, by consuming vegetation at rates measured in tons per day, could deforest entire regions, creating feedback loops that altered local climate patterns, changed soil composition, shifted the balance of nutrients and moisture that had supported their food sources. Their success became the architect of their failure, entropy expressing itself through the ecological consequences of their own existence. The mathematics of sustainability operated according to principles that no individual organism, regardless of size, could fully comprehend or control. Yet entropy's relationship with gigantism reveals paradoxes that speak to deeper principles governing the organization of complexity. While large individuals are more vulnerable to entropic decay, large populations can sometimes achieve stability unavailable to smaller groups. Giant sequoia forests persist for thousands of years, not despite their size but because of it. Individual trees large enough to survive fires, droughts, and climate fluctuations that would eliminate smaller species, creating communities stable enough to maintain themselves across geological timescales. The thermodynamics of gigantism also reveal why water has consistently hosted the largest forms of life. Aquatic environments provide thermal buffering that reduces the energy costs of maintaining organizational coherence across large volumes of living tissue. The ocean's thermal mass creates stability that allows giants to develop without the constant energy expenditure required to maintain homeostasis in the more volatile terrestrial environment. Entropy proceeds more slowly in water, allowing complexity to accumulate to scales impossible on land. Even more remarkably, some forms of gigantism appear to represent strategies for slowing entropy's work rather than simply growing despite it. The massive hearts of blue whales beat so slowly that each pulse moves blood through circulatory systems with an efficiency that smaller hearts cannot achieve. Their size creates economies of scale that actually reduce the per-unit energy costs of existence, allowing them to maintain organizational complexity with less effort than smaller creatures require. They are proof that under the right conditions, gigantism can represent a victory over entropy rather than merely a temporary resistance to it. The cultural implications of entropy's relationship with size extend beyond biology into the realm of human civilization itself. Our technologies, our social organizations all follow similar patterns: growth that requires increasing energy investment to maintain complexity, success that creates conditions for eventual failure, achievements that carry within themselves the mathematical certainty of their own obsolescence. The lesson of the giants speaks directly to the sustainability of any complex system, biological or otherwise. Perhaps most profound is entropy's role in preserving memory itself. The fossils that allow us to reconstruct ancient gigantism exist only because entropy's work was occasionally interrupted by conditions that favored preservation over decay, rapid burial, mineral replacement, chemical environments that prevented the normal processes of decomposition. The giants we know from fossils represent not typical death but exceptional preservation, moments when entropy's universal tendency was temporarily reversed by geological circumstances rare enough to seem miraculous. This creates a profound irony. Our knowledge of ancient giants comes not from their resistance to entropy but from entropy's occasional failures, from moments when the universal tendency toward disorder was overcome by forces that created order from decay, information from dissolution, memory from the very processes that normally erase all traces of existence. The fossil record itself is proof that entropy, while inevitable, is not uniform, that under the right conditions the complex can persist, the organized can endure, the magnificent can leave traces that survive long after the energy that created them has dissipated into the background noise of a cooling universe. And in our modern world, where human activity operates on scales that rival the geological processes that once supported natural giants, we find ourselves faced with questions about entropy, sustainability, and the long-term consequences of our own experiments with complexity and size. And in our modern world, where human activity operates on scales that rival the geological processes that once supported natural giants, we find ourselves faced with questions about entropy, sustainability, and the long-term consequences of our own experiments with complexity and size. If giants once walked the earth and left traces that persist across hundreds of millions of years, what evidence of our own civilization's brief moment of planetary dominance will remain for future archaeologists working in deep time? We are creating each day a new category of fossil technofossils, the mineral signatures of industrial civilization that will persist in rock layers long after our cities have crumbled and our species has vanished. Plastic polymers that will survive unchanged for millennia, concrete structures whose chemical signatures will remain detectable in sedimentary layers for millions of years, metal alloys that exist nowhere in nature and will serve as unmistakable markers of our technological presence. We are writing our existence into the geological record with the same permanence that recorded the presence of ancient giants, creating a thin but comprehensive layer that future paleontologists will call the Anthropocene. But the scale of our impact raises speculative questions that push against the boundaries of what we consider possible. If a species that has existed for mere hundreds of thousands of years can alter planetary chemistry, atmospheric composition, and global climate patterns, what might the signatures of other civilizations look like if they had achieved technological sophistication over timescales measured in millions rather than centuries? Could traces of lost technological giants exist in rock layers we have not yet learned to read, in chemical signatures we have not yet recognized as artificial? The deep time perspective that reveals ancient biological giants also suggests the possibility of technological giants whose existence operated on scales that dwarf our current industrial capacity. Consider what a million-year-old technological civilization might have accomplished: engineering projects that spanned continents, material science that created substances more durable than any natural mineral, energy systems that operated on planetary scale. The traces of such achievements might be subtle enough to escape detection by archaeologists trained to recognize only recent human artifacts, comprehensive enough to exist as background signatures in global chemistry. Some isotopic ratios in ancient rocks show patterns that challenge conventional explanations. Concentrations of rare elements that suggest processing techniques, distributions of materials that imply transportation across distances that would require technological capability, chemical signatures that resemble the byproducts of industrial processes we assume to be uniquely modern. These anomalies might represent natural processes we do not yet understand, or they might preserve evidence of activities that operated on scales so vast, so ancient, that they exist at the very limits of our ability to recognize artificial patterns. The mathematics of preservation suggest that truly advanced civilizations might leave traces so subtle they appear natural, so comprehensive they blend into the background chemistry of planetary evolution. A species that achieved mastery over material science might create substances that integrate seamlessly with geological processes, that become part of the mineral record rather than foreign intrusions within it. Their cities might be built from materials designed to weather gracefully, their waste products engineered to serve as nutrients for the ecosystems that followed them. But the most intriguing possibility is that technological gigantism might follow patterns similar to biological gigantism, periods of rapid expansion followed by collapse, cycles of complexity that rise and fall according to the same mathematical principles that governed the rise and fall of sauropods and marine reptiles. If this is true, then the Anthropocene might represent not the first but merely the most recent experiment in planetary scale technology, the latest iteration of a pattern that has repeated itself across geological time whenever intelligence evolved to the point where it could manipulate matter on industrial scales. Our own technofossils provide a template for recognizing such patterns. The aluminum we extract and refine exists in concentrations and purities that never occur naturally, creating chemical signatures that will remain detectable for millions of years. The isotopic ratios of uranium in regions where we have tested nuclear weapons will serve as chronological markers for future geologists, pinpointing our presence in time with accuracy measured in decades. The carbon isotope signatures of fossil fuel combustion will mark our atmospheric chemistry experiments in ice cores and sediment layers around the globe. Even our biological manipulations create lasting signatures. The genetic modifications we introduce into crop plants and domestic animals will persist in the DNA record long after the species themselves have evolved beyond recognition. We are editing the genetic library of the planet with the same permanence that evolution used to create the diversity we inherited, adding chapters written in the artificial languages of bioengineering to a book whose earlier pages record the achievements of natural giants. Perhaps most remarkably, our space technology creates the possibility of technofossils that will outlast the Earth itself. The satellites and space probes we have launched will orbit the Sun for millions of years, carrying information about our civilization, encoded in materials and devices that represent our attempt to achieve a different kind of gigantism. Not size measured in tons but influence measured in astronomical distance, presence that extends beyond the planetary boundaries that constrained all previous forms of life. The search for evidence of ancient technological civilizations becomes, in this context, a search for patterns of chemical and physical organization that suggest intelligence operating on scales larger than individual organisms, coordination that extends beyond biological communities, planning that operates across timescales longer than evolutionary adaptation. We are learning to look for giants not just in fossils but in the organization of matter itself, in patterns that suggest purpose operating on planetary scale. This perspective transforms our understanding of both the past and the future, suggesting that the age of giants might not be a historical curiosity but a recurring pattern, a cycle that includes not just biological but technological experiments in scale and organization. We may be living through the latest iteration of an ancient pattern, creating our own layer in the geological record while remaining largely unaware of the similar layers that might exist beneath us, waiting for archaeologists who know how to recognize the signatures of intelligence expressed through mastery over matter and energy. But to understand these patterns fully, we must consider the role of time itself as the ultimate giant, the force that shapes not just individual lives but entire geological eras, not just species but the very possibility of existence at the scales we have been exploring. But to understand these patterns fully, we must consider the role of time itself as the ultimate giant, the force that shapes not just individual lives but entire geological eras, not just species but the very possibility of existence at the scales we have been exploring. Time operates with a patience that dwarfs even the longest-lived giants, with a persistence that reduces mountains to sand, continents to fragments, civilizations to the faintest chemical signatures barely distinguishable from background noise. Time is the sculptor whose chisel never rests, whose work proceeds at rates so slow they seem motionless until viewed across the vast perspectives that geology provides. The greatest mountains, those monuments to the Earth's tectonic ambitions, exist as temporary wrinkles in processes that operate across hundreds of millions of years. The Himalayas, which seem permanent from our brief human perspective, are merely the current expression of continental collision. Mountain range that is both ancient by human standards and newly formed by geological measures, destined to be worn away grain by grain until only their chemical signatures remain to mark where they once stood. The giants we have followed through this journey existed within windows of time so brief, relative to planetary history, that their entire evolutionary irradiation and extinction represents merely a passing moment in the Earth's longer rhythm. The age of dinosaurs, which lasted over 160 million years and seems almost eternal from our perspective, occupies less than 4% of the planet's total history. The atmospheric conditions that supported giant dragonflies persisted for even shorter periods, brief experiments in planetary chemistry that created and then eliminated the conditions necessary for such forms of life. Yet time's relationship with scale reveals paradoxes that speak to the deeper patterns governing existence at all levels. While time erases individual giants with relentless efficiency, it also creates the conditions that make giants possible in the first place. The slow accumulation of oxygen in ancient atmospheres required hundreds of millions of years, a patient process that gradually built the chemical foundation necessary for gigantism. The formation of the fossil fuels that powered industrial civilization required the patient compression of ancient forests across geological timescales, converting biological excess into stored energy that would later fuel technological giants. Time operates as both destroyer and creator, wearing away the achievements of one era while simultaneously laying the groundwork for the experiments of the next. The erosion of ancient mountain ranges provides the nutrients that enrich soils capable of supporting giant forests. The decay of previous ecosystems creates the chemical conditions necessary for new forms of life to explore possibilities that had never before been accessible. Time recycles ambition, transforms the substance of failed experiments into the raw materials for future success. The fossil record itself represents time's most remarkable achievement, the preservation of information across scales so vast they challenge our ability to comprehend duration. The chemical signatures we read in ancient rocks represent messages transmitted across hundreds of millions of years, communications from worlds so different from our own that they might as well be alien planets. Time has served as both the medium and the message, carrying information about ancient giants through periods of darkness and transformation that would have erased any less patient form of memory.
But time also reveals the mathematical principles that govern the persistence of information itself. Simple patterns survive longer than complex ones. General principles persist while specific details fade. The basic anatomy of vertebrate body plans has remained recognizable across 500 million years, while the particular adaptations that distinguished individual species vanish within thousands. Time filters information, preserving what is fundamental while allowing the ephemeral to disappear, creating a fossil record that emphasizes broad patterns over individual variations. This filtering effect operates at all scales and across all forms of organization. The oldest rocks preserve evidence of the most basic chemical processes while losing traces of more complex interactions. The oldest fossils reveal fundamental biological patterns while obscuring the behavioral details that defined individual lives. The oldest human artifacts preserve evidence of general technological principles, while the specific cultural context that gave them meaning fade into speculation and interpretation. Time's work as a sculptor becomes most apparent when viewed across the complete history of complex life on Earth. The progression from simple to complex, from small to large, from generalized to specialized, represents not directed evolution but statistical inevitability, the natural result of random experimentation operating across timescales long enough for every possibility to be explored. Giants appear whenever conditions allow them, persist as long as those conditions remain stable, and vanish when time's patient work shifts the parameters that made their existence possible. Perhaps most remarkably, Time reveals that gigantism itself is not an aberration but a fundamental tendency of complex systems operating across sufficient duration. Given enough time, life explores every possible scale of organization, pushes against every physical limit, tests every mathematical boundary. The giants we have encountered in this journey represent not exceptions to natural law but expressions of natural law operating across timescales that individual experience cannot encompass. Our human perspective, constrained by lifespans measured in decades rather than eons, struggles to perceive time's true scale of operation. We experience erosion as imperceptible, climate change as gradual, evolution as theoretical. But from time's perspective, mountains rise and fall like waves on water, ice ages come and go like seasons, entire forms of life appear and disappear like weather patterns. The giants that once dominated the earth exist, from this perspective, as brief experiments in organization, temporary explorations of possibility that flickered into existence and vanished, with the speed of thoughts passing through a mind whose attention spans geological age. This perspective transforms our understanding of impermanence itself, suggesting that while individual giants inevitably fall to entropy's patient work, the capacity for gigantism persists as a fundamental property of matter and energy organized across sufficient scales of space and time. The age of giants has not ended but simply migrated, exploring new forms and new environments while waiting for conditions that will again favor the magnificent, the monumental, the impossibly large. But to understand what gigantism means for conscious beings like ourselves, we must consider how scale shapes not just physical existence but the very nature of identity, perception and meaning itself. But to understand what gigantism means for conscious beings like ourselves, we must consider how scale shapes not just physical existence but the very nature of identity, perception and meaning itself. If scale defines the boundaries within which consciousness operates, then the giants of the past inhabited not just different environments but different universes of experience, realities where the fundamental categories of thought, time, space, danger, safety, other meant something entirely different from what they mean to creatures built at our modest proportions. Imagine the weight of being a giant, not just physically but psychologically, emotionally, experientially. Your consciousness would be housed in a body whose movements required planning measured in minutes rather than seconds, whose responses to stimuli unfolded across temporal scales that would test the patience of any nervous system evolved for rapid reaction. The simple act of turning your head would become a deliberate choice rather than an automatic response, each gesture carrying momentum that must be calculated, controlled, compensated for with the precision of an engineer rather than the spontaneity of a natural move. The boundaries of your identity would extend far beyond the conventional limits of skin and bone, as a creature whose footsteps could crush entire communities of smaller organisms, whose breathing could alter local atmospheric conditions, whose waste products could fertilize or poison territories measured in acres, you would exist in a state of constant awareness that your very presence reshaped the world around you. Identity at this scale becomes inseparable from responsibility, self-awareness indistinguishable from environmental impact assessment. Your temporal experience would operate according to rhythms that smaller creatures could never fully comprehend. With a heart that beats perhaps once every 10 seconds, with metabolic processes that unfold across hours rather than minutes, with growth patterns that span decades rather than years, your subjective experience of time would dilate into durations that would seem almost geological from the perspective of smaller, faster creatures. What they experienced as seasons, you might experience as brief fluctuations in daily routine. The social dimensions of giant consciousness would require new forms of communication, new protocols for interaction between beings whose individual presence could dominate entire landscapes. Conversation would become a form of territorial negotiation, requiring careful attention to spacing, positioning, the acoustic management of voices that could carry across continents. Intimacy would be a choreographed dance between creatures whose casual contact could result in accidental injury, whose expressions of affection must be calibrated with the precision of diplomatic protocol. Your sensory experience would be transformed by the physics of scale in ways that would alter the fundamental categories of perception. Sound would travel differently through the medium of your massive body, creating internal acoustics that smaller creatures could never experience. The deep resonance of organs the size of buildings, the harmonic interactions between circulatory systems that operate at the scale of municipal infrastructure. Your visual perspective,
elevated dozens of feet above the ground, would provide access to spatial relationships invisible to ground-level observers, but would sacrifice the detailed resolution available to creatures whose eyes could focus on smaller scale. Fear as an emotional category would be transformed by the mathematical realities of size. Few things could threaten you directly, but the vulnerability that comes with gigantism would create new categories of anxiety. The fear of accidentally causing harm, the constant awareness that your survival depends on environmental stability across scales of space and time, that individual consciousness cannot fully monitor or control. Your fears would be ecological rather than personal, geological rather than immediate, atmospheric rather than local. Memory too would operate according to different principles when housed in a nervous system that spans distances measured in yards rather than inches. The time required for neural signals to travel from extremities to brain would create delays that smaller creatures never experience, forcing consciousness to operate with a temporal lag that would fundamentally alter the relationship between stimulus and response, perception and action, intention and implementation. You would live slightly in the past, always reacting to information that was already outdated by the time it reached the decision-making centers of your enormous mind. The boundaries between self and environment would blur in ways that challenge our conventional understanding of individual identity. As a creature whose exhaled breath could influence local weather patterns, whose movements could alter the flow of river, whose digestive processes could change soil chemistry across territories, you would exist in a state of constant biochemical interaction with your surroundings that makes the modern concept of isolated individuality seem almost absurd. You would be less an organism than an ecosystem, less an individual than a geological process with consciousness. Your relationship with mortality would be shaped by the mathematical realities of size and longevity. With lifespans potentially measured in centuries, with growth that continues throughout life, with metabolic processes that slow as mass increases, you would experience aging as a gradual transformation into something even more magnificent and unwieldy than your death, when it came, would be less an event than a process, a gradual dissolution that might span years or decades, as your enormous systems slowly shut down in sequence. Perhaps most profound would be the existential weight of existing as a creature whose individual life has planetary significance. Your birth, your growth, your reproduction, your death would be events that reshape ecosystems, alter evolutionary pressures for countless other species, leave traces in the geological record that persist for millions of years. The weight of such significance would create forms of responsibility and awareness that no creature built at smaller scales could fully comprehend. The loneliness of such existence might be the most challenging aspect of giant consciousness, the isolation that comes from being one of few creatures, operating at your scale, the difficulty of finding others of your kind across territories measured in continents. The challenge of maintaining social bonds across distances and durations that smaller creatures traverse in lifetime. Your closest relationships might be measured not in shared experiences, but in shared territories, not in communication but in the parallel navigation of similar challenges across similar scales. This exploration of giant consciousness reveals why the disappearance of the giants represents not just biological loss, but the elimination of entire categories of experience, ways of being conscious that no longer exist anywhere in the universe we inhabit. And yet these lost forms of awareness live on in cultural memory, in the myths and dreams that preserve what direct experience can no longer provide. This exploration of giant consciousness reveals why the disappearance of the giants represents not just biological loss, but the elimination of entire categories of experience, ways of being conscious that no longer exist anywhere in the universe we inhabit. And yet, these lost forms of awareness live on in cultural memory, in the myths and dreams that preserve what direct experience can no longer provide. As if our unconscious minds retain some ancestral memory of a world where size operated according to different rules, where consciousness could inhabit forms that dwarf our current existence. Every culture has discovered giants in its imagination, created stories of beings whose scale transforms them into forces of nature rather than mere creatures. The Titans of Greek mythology, the giants of Norse legend, the ogres and cyclopes that populate folklore from every continent. These are not simply fantasies, but attempts to reconstruct experiences that once existed in reality, cultural excavations of memories that exist somewhere in the deep structure of human consciousness, echoes of encounters that predate written history by millions of years. Consider how persistent these images are across cultures that had no contact with each other, how similar the characteristics attributed to giants regardless of geography or historical period. They are always described as beings whose movements shake the earth, whose voices carry across vast distances, whose lifespans exceed those of ordinary mortals by factors that suggest different relationships with time itself. They are portrayed as creatures who exist at the intersection between the biological and the geological, individuals whose personal lives have environmental consequences that persist across generations. Perhaps most remarkably, these mythological giants are consistently described in terms that mirror the actual physics of gigantism discovered by modern paleontology. They are slow-moving but immensely powerful, patient but not necessarily wise, vulnerable to threats that would not affect smaller creatures, but immune to dangers that would devastate entire communities of ordinary beings. They require vast quantities of food, inhabit territories measured in kingdoms rather than acres, and their conflicts create landscape features, mountains, valleys, rivers that persist long after the giants themselves have vanished. The psychological resonance of giant imagery suggests that these cultural memories serve functions beyond mere entertainment or explanation. Dreams of giants, both literal dreams experienced during sleep and the metaphorical giants that populate our waking imagination, appear to represent attempts by consciousness to experience scale beyond the boundaries of individual existence, to imagine what it might feel like to be significant at planetary rather than merely personal level. Children especially seem drawn to giant imagery in ways that suggest these stories serve developmental functions related to understanding scale, power, and individual significance within larger systems. The popularity of stories about friendly giants, beings whose size makes them powerful, but whose consciousness makes them gentle, speaks to a deep desire to reconcile the intimidating realities of scale with the human need for connection and safety. These stories teach children that size and consciousness can coexist, that power does not necessarily imply threat, but the giants of human imagination also carry darker resonances, serving as repositories for fears about forces beyond individual control, the ogres and monsters that devour humans, the titans who threaten to destroy the ordered world, the giants whose conflicts create chaos and destruction. These represent projections of anxiety about existing in a universe where individual consciousness operates at scales too small to influence the larger forces that determine survival and extinction. Freudian and Jungian psychology both recognize giants as archetypal figures that represent relationships between individual consciousness and transpersonal forces, the parents who loom over childhood experience, the institutions that dwarf individual agency, the historical processes that shape human destiny across scales of time that exceed individual comprehension. The prevalence of giant imagery in dreams and neuroses suggests that scale anxiety, fear of insignificance, desire for greater impact, ambivalence about power represents one of the fundamental tensions of human consciousness. Modern giant imagery, particularly in science fiction and fantasy, often explores themes directly related to the actual giants we have discovered in the fossil record. Stories about kaiju and movie monsters consistently focus on the environmental consequences of gigantism, the challenges of coexistence between beings operating at different scales, the tragedy of creatures whose size makes them incompatible with the worlds they inhabit. These are not simply adventure stories but explorations of the same mathematical and ecological principles that govern the existence of real ancient giants. The persistence of giant imagery in an age when we know that such creatures existed in reality suggests that cultural memory operates across timescales much longer than historical memory, that information about environmental conditions and biological possibilities can persist in symbolic form long after the direct experiences that created those symbols have vanished. We may be carriers of genetic or cultural information about gigantism that predates not just human civilization but human spatiation itself. Perhaps most intriguingly, the giants of human imagination often possess attributes that actual fossil giants never achieved: intelligence that operates at scales commensurate with their physical size, consciousness that spans the territories their bodies dominate, wisdom that reflects their extended lifespans and enlarged perspectives. These mythological giants represent not just memories of what was but projections of what might be possible, if consciousness could be scaled up to match the physical possibilities that biology has already explored. The study of actual ancient giants transforms our understanding of these cultural symbols, revealing them as less fantastical and more documentary than we previously recognized. The dragons that hoard treasure and devastate kingdoms begin to seem less like pure imagination, and more like folk memories of predators, whose individual hunting territories encompassed areas larger than modern nations, whose presence could indeed bring ruin to human-scale communities, simply through the environmental consequences of their existence. But the resonance between mythological and paleontological giants also suggests that the human fascination with size represents more than nostalgia for a vanished world. It may reflect an intuitive understanding that scale represents one of the fundamental dimensions along which consciousness and experience can expand, that the exploration of gigantism in imagination prepares us for encounters with forms of existence that operate at scales beyond our current experience. This preparation becomes increasingly relevant as we recognize that our modern world is creating its own forms of gigantism. Climate and technological systems that operate at scales comparable to those that once supported biological giants. Forces that may require new forms of consciousness capable of operating at correspondingly expanded scale. This preparation becomes increasingly relevant as we recognize that our modern world is creating its own forms of gigantism. Climate and technological systems that operate at scales comparable to those that once supported biological giants. Forces that may require new forms of consciousness capable of operating at correspondingly expanded scale. Climate itself operates as the ultimate cycle that governs the possibilities for gigantism, a planetary metabolism that breathes in and out across geological timescales, creating and eliminating the conditions that make large-scale life possible or impossible. The Earth's climate system has always operated as a vast engine of possibility, cycling through configurations that alternately favor and discourage experiments in biological scale. Ice ages compress the opportunities for gigantism, locking water into polar caps and creating environmental instability that favors smaller, more adaptable forms of life. Greenhouse periods expand those opportunities, releasing energy and resources in quantities sufficient to support metabolisms that operate at industrial scales, creating the extended periods of environmental stability that gigantism requires. We are currently living through one of these transitional periods, a time when human activity is driving climate change at rates that rival the geological processes that once determined the fate of ancient giants. The atmospheric chemistry we are creating through industrial activity resembles in some ways the conditions that supported gigantism in the past. Elevated carbon dioxide concentrations, altered ocean chemistry, global temperature patterns that favor productivity over stability. But these changes are happening at speeds that biological systems cannot match, creating opportunities for new forms of gigantism, while simultaneously eliminating the conditions that might allow biological life to exploit those opportunities. The mathematics of climate cycling reveals patterns that operate across multiple timescales simultaneously. Milankovitch cycles driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt create rhythms that span tens of thousands of years, influencing ice age cycles that alternately concentrate and distribute global water resources. Longer cycles driven by plate tectonics and volcanic activity operate across millions of years, creating supercontinents and breaking them apart, concentrating and dispersing landmasses in configurations that either facilitate or prevent the evolution of gigantic. Ocean circulation patterns themselves driven by these longer climate cycles create the nutrient distribution systems that determine whether marine environments can support the massive filter feeders and marine reptiles that characterized ancient seas. When continents are configured to create restricted ocean basins, nutrient concentrations can build to levels that support food webs rich enough for gigantism. When continents separate to create open ocean circulation, nutrients become diluted across volumes too vast to support the kind of biological productivity that giants require.
Atmospheric composition cycles operate on timescales that span the entire history of complex life, driven by the evolution of photosynthesis, the burial and exposure of organic carbon, the chemical weathering of rocks that releases or sequesters greenhouse gases, the oxygen levels that supported giant insects in the Carboniferous period, resulted from forest productivity that operated across millions of years, gradually building atmospheric concentrations that made new forms of metabolism possible, until the very success of those forests altered global carbon cycling in ways that eliminated the conditions that had made their success possible. These climate cycles create what paleontologists call evolutionary opportunities, windows of time when environmental conditions align to make new experiments in size and form possible. The Permian period, just before the Great Extinction that ended the Paleozoic era, saw experiments in terrestrial gigantism that pushed the boundaries of what land-based ecosystems could support. The Jurassic period created marine conditions that supported the largest marine reptiles ever known. The Cenozoic era has seen multiple experiments with mammalian gigantism, each coinciding with specific configurations of climate and geography that created temporary opportunities for large-scale land animals. But these same cycles that create opportunities for gigantism also contain the seeds of its destruction. Climate systems that remain stable long enough to support the evolution of giants eventually become destabilized by their own success. The atmospheric changes created by highly productive ecosystems alter global temperature patterns, which change ocean circulation, which affects weather patterns, which influence the very ecosystems whose productivity drove the initial change. Gigantism, by requiring such specific environmental conditions, becomes vulnerable to the climate instabilities that its own existence helps to create. The current climate cycle, driven by human activity rather than natural processes, represents an unprecedented experiment in the relationship between intelligence and environmental change. We are creating climate conditions similar to those that supported ancient giants, but at speeds that make biological adaptation impossible. The result may be opportunities for technological rather than biological gigantism, artificial systems that can exploit the energy abundance and environmental instability that characterize rapid climate change in ways that biological systems cannot. Our industrial civilization already operates at scales comparable to geological processes, moving quantities of material and energy that rival volcanic activity, altering atmospheric and oceanic chemistry at rates that approach those associated with mass extinction events. We are becoming giants not through biological evolution but through technological amplification, creating systems whose individual components remain human-sized, but whose collective impacts operate at planetary scale. This technological gigantism faces the same mathematical constraints that limited biological giants: energy requirements that increase exponentially with scale, vulnerability to disruptions that affect the complex systems that maintain organizational coherence, dependence on environmental conditions that may not persist indefinitely. The difference is that technological giants can potentially adapt and reconfigure themselves at speeds that biological giants could never achieve, creating forms of large-scale organization that might persist through environmental changes that would eliminate purely biological forms of gigantism. But the most significant aspect of our current climate cycle may be that it represents the first time that gigantism has become conscious of itself, aware of its own environmental impacts and capable of making deliberate choices about the forms and scales of organization it creates. We are the first giants to possess the knowledge necessary to understand the climate cycles that determine the sustainability of gigantism itself, potentially making us the first giants capable of creating conditions that could support not just our own existence but the return of biological gigantism in forms that could coexist with technological civilization. This consciousness of scale and its consequences represents a new phase in the relationship between gigantism and climate, one that suggests possibilities for forms of large-scale existence that could persist through multiple climate cycles rather than becoming victims of the environmental changes they help to create. This consciousness of scale and its consequences represents a new phase in the relationship between gigantism and climate, one that suggests possibilities for forms of large-scale existence that could persist through multiple climate cycles rather than becoming victims of the environmental changes they help to create. Yet the more we understand about the history of giants, the more we are forced to confront a humbling truth. Across the vast majority of Earth's history, it has been the small who have inherited the Earth, the modest who have outlasted the magnificent, the humble who have proven most capable of survival across the upheavals that regularly reset the biological experiments of our planet. Consider the ants, those social insects whose individual bodies could fit on your fingernail, but whose colonies operate as superorganisms that can persist for decades, whose collective intelligence solves logistical problems that challenge human engineers, whose global biomass exceeds that of all large mammals combined. They represent a fundamentally different approach to achieving significance, not through individual gigantism but through collective organization, not by growing large but by thinking together, coordinating actions across scales of space and time that individual consciousness could never encompass. An ant colony functions as a distributed giant, a form of large-scale organization that achieves the environmental impact and territorial control of creatures many times larger, while remaining composed of individuals small enough to survive environmental disruptions that would eliminate conventional giants. When catastrophe strikes, drought, flood, climate change, Mass extinction ant colonies can disperse into their component individuals, survive the crisis at small scales, then reaggregate when conditions improve. They have solved the fundamental vulnerability of gigantism by learning to be large when conditions permit and small when conditions demand. The fossil record reveals that this strategy of collective gigantism has been remarkably successful across geological time. Social insects have survived every mass extinction event that has eliminated individual giants, persisting through climate changes that have reset terrestrial ecosystems multiple times. Their success lies not in resistance to change but in flexibility, not in dominating environments but in adapting to them, not in growing large enough to ignore disruption but in remaining small enough to accommodate. Mice too represent a masterclass in the survival advantages of staying small. These rodents have colonized every continent except Antarctica, adapted to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, survived alongside dinosaurs and outlasted them, coexisted with mammalian giants and inherited the territories those giants abandoned when climate conditions shifted beyond their tolerance ranges. Their success lies in metabolic efficiency. They can survive on food resources that would be insufficient to sustain creatures even twice their size, reproduce rapidly enough to recover from population crashes that would drive larger species to extinction, and adapt behaviorally and physiologically to environmental changes across timescales too brief for larger creatures to accommodate. The mathematics of survival consistently favors characteristics that gigantism makes impossible: rapid reproduction, dietary flexibility, minimal resource requirements, ability to shelter in spaces too small for larger creatures, capacity for hibernation or dormancy during unfavorable conditions. Small creatures can exploit temporary resource abundance without becoming dependent on its continuation, can survive on the margins of ecosystems rather than requiring the stable centers that giants need, can evolve and adapt across timescales measured in years rather than millennia. Yet the persistence of small creatures across geological time does more than simply demonstrate survival strategies. It preserves evolutionary potential, maintaining genetic diversity and adaptive flexibility that becomes crucial when environmental conditions again favor experimentation with larger forms. The mammals that eventually grew into giants after the dinosaur extinction were descended from small creatures that had survived in the shadows of the Mesozoic giants, carrying within their modest bodies the genetic templates that would later be scaled up when opportunities for gigantism returned. This pattern of small survivors serving as the foundation for new experiments in gigantism appears repeatedly in the fossil record. After every mass extinction event, the creatures that emerge to eventually achieve large size are descended from small generalists that survived the crisis not through specialization but through flexibility, not through efficiency but through resilience. The age of giants always emerges from the persistence of the humble. Gigantism always builds on foundations laid by creatures whose greatest achievement was learning how to endure. The success of small creatures also reveals something profound about the nature of evolutionary innovation. The genetic and developmental mechanisms that enable dramatic increases in size are often first refined in small creatures living under resource constraints that favor efficiency over excess. The metabolic pathways that allow rapid energy processing, the developmental programs that coordinate complex growth, the physiological innovations that manage the transport of materials across different scales. These are often perfected in small creatures before being scaled up to support gigantism. Modern ecology demonstrates that small creatures often serve functions in ecosystems that giants cannot fulfill, creating the environmental conditions that make gigantism possible in the first place. Soil bacteria and fungi decompose organic matter and cycle nutrients at rates that support plant productivity. Small herbivores and detritivores process plant material in ways that maintain the productivity cycles that can eventually support large herbivores. Small predators control populations of organisms that might otherwise disrupt the ecological balance that giants require. The relationship between the small and the large in natural systems suggests that gigantism represents not an alternative to small-scale organization but a culmination of it, a phenomenon that emerges when small-scale processes have created sufficient abundance and stability to support experiments in size. The giants are possible only because of the persistent work of countless small creatures that create and maintain the environmental conditions giants require. Perhaps most remarkably, the study of small survivors suggests that the capacity for gigantism may itself be a form of information that persists in small creatures across periods when environmental conditions make large size impossible.
The genetic programs that govern the developmental pathways that coordinate growth, the physiological innovations that support large-scale metabolism, these persist in dormant or reduced form in small creatures, ready to be activated when environmental conditions again favor their expression. This suggests that the age of giants never truly ends but simply becomes later, preserved in the genetic memory of small survivors who carry forward the biological innovations that made gigantism possible, while remaining small enough to survive the environmental upheavals that periodically eliminate large-scale life. The future may belong to whoever learns to combine the persistence of the small with the ambitions of the large. This suggests that the age of giants never truly ends but simply becomes later, preserved in the genetic memory of small survivors who carry forward the biological innovations that made gigantism possible, while remaining small enough to survive the environmental upheavals that periodically eliminate large-scale life. The future may belong to whoever learns to combine the persistence of the small with the ambitions of the large, and perhaps looking at our modern world with the perspective we have gained from studying ancient giants, we must ask whether that combination has already emerged in the form of human civilization itself, whether we have become the new giants operating at scales that rival those of the ancient creatures we have been following through deep time. Consider the footprint of a single human life in the 21st century, the materials we consume, the energy we process, the waste we produce, the territory our activities influence when calculated across a full lifespan. These numbers approach the resource requirements and environmental impacts of creatures that once stood 40 feet tall and weighed as much as locomotives. We have achieved gigantism not through biological evolution, but through technological amplification, each individual human functioning as the nervous system for a distributed body that includes machines, infrastructure and supply chains that span continents. Our cities, viewed from the proper perspective, reveal themselves as collective organisms that exhibit all the characteristics we have identified with ancient gigantism. They metabolize resources at rates measured in millions of tons per day, process energy flows that rival geological processes, generate waste products in quantities that alter regional chemistry, and create microclimates that influence weather patterns across areas larger than most ancient creatures ever traveled. New York City consumes electricity at rates comparable to the metabolic requirements of a creature the size of Manhattan, processes food and water through distribution networks that function like circulatory systems, and generates heat that influences atmospheric conditions across distances measured in hundreds of miles. But perhaps more remarkably, we are giants that have learned to think collectively, across the scales at which we operate. The internet represents a nervous system that spans the globe, processing information and coordinating responses across temporal and spatial scales that no individual consciousness could encompass. Our economic systems function as distributed decision-making networks that allocate resources according to principles that emerge from millions of individual choices, but operate at scales that influence planetary processes. We have achieved the collective intelligence that mythological giants possessed in imagination but that biological giants never achieved in reality. Our species exhibits all the vulnerabilities that have historically characterized gigantism, scaled up to match our technological amplification. We require environmental stability across larger territories and longer timescales than any previous form of life, depend on supply chains and resource flows that span continents and operate with precision that leaves little margin for disruption. Our specialization has reached levels that make us vulnerable to environmental changes that more generalized creatures might survive with ease. Our population density and resource consumption rates create feedback effects that alter the very environmental conditions we require for survival. Yet we also represent the first form of gigantism that has become conscious of its own environmental impact, capable of studying the mathematical principles that govern sustainability at large scales, potentially able to learn from the fate of previous giants and avoid the cycles of growth and collapse that have characterized all previous experiments with large-scale organization. We are giants with the capacity for self-reflection, gigantism that has developed the ability to understand its own constraints and possibly transcend them through conscious choice rather than unconscious evolution. The technofossils we are creating will mark our presence in the geological record with the same permanence that preserves evidence of ancient biological giants, but with signatures that suggest forms of organization that operated according to different principles. Our plastics and concrete, our isotopic signatures and genetic modifications, our atmospheric chemistry experiments and space-based artifacts. These represent attempts at achieving gigantism that could persist across climate cycles, that could adapt to environmental changes through conscious reconfiguration, rather than depending on the slow processes of biological evolution. But the most significant aspect of human gigantism may be its distributed nature. The fact that our large-scale impacts emerge from the coordination of billions of individuals who remain biologically small, metabolically modest, reproductively flexible. We have achieved collective gigantism while preserving individual humanity, created systems that operate at planetary scales while maintaining the capacity to disperse and survive at human scales when necessary. We are simultaneously the giants and the small survivors, the large-scale experiment and the backup system that could outlast our own success. This dual nature may represent the key to creating forms of gigantism that could persist indefinitely, that could survive the environmental changes they create rather than becoming victims of their own success. By remaining biologically human while becoming technologically giant, we preserve options that purely biological giants never possessed: the ability to consciously choose smaller scales when environmental conditions demand it, the capacity to reconfigure our large-scale systems rather than depending on environmental stability for survival, the potential to create forms of gigantism that enhance rather than degrade the environmental conditions that sustain them. The perspective gained from studying ancient giants suggests that our current moment represents not just another experiment in large-scale organization, but potentially the first experiment that could learn from all previous experiments. The first form of gigantism that has access to the complete history of gigantism's successes and failures. We are giants with libraries, large-scale organization, with historical memory, collective intelligence with individual consciousness. Whether this combination will prove sufficient to break the cycles that have limited all previous forms of gigantism remains to be seen. But as we stand at the threshold between the age of ancient giants and whatever age our own gigantism might create, we carry within ourselves the genetic heritage of the small survivors who outlasted every previous age of giants, the technological capacity to operate at scales that rival geological processes, and perhaps most importantly, the consciousness to choose what kind of giants we become. The silence that follows us may be different from the silence that followed previous giants, not the silence of extinction, but the silence of transformation, not the end of an age but the beginning of forms of existence that have learned to be both large and small, both powerful and sustainable, both giant and enduring. In this silence, new stories are already beginning, written not in stone and fossil but in the patient mathematics of consciousness, learning to operate at scales worthy of the magnificent, mysterious, impossibly complex planet that has hosted every form of gigantism we have encountered on this journey through deep time and vast space, through the memory of creatures whose existence challenges every assumption about what is possible, what is sustainable, and what forms life might yet discover in the vast laboratory of time that stretches ahead of us, as patient and persistent as the geological forces that once carved valleys deep enough for giants to walk through, as enduring as the stars whose light has traveled across cosmic distances to illuminate the evidence that giants once ruled the earth, and may yet rule again.